Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm Abby Shermer, and this is part 4 of your counterplan lecture. In this part, we will be covering counterplan theory. If you haven't yet, you might want to go back and watch the first 3 parts of this lecture series to review how to answer a counterplan and how to extend a counterplan in the block. As a reminder, you should feel free to take breaks to reduce fatigue and ensure you are paying attention. And you can also rewatch parts of this lecture series. It might be a bit confusing before you start this video. Finally, I've created a note document attached to this video series that you can take notes or write down questions. You can always send me an email with questions at abbyshermer@gmail.com, and I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. So let's get started talking about counterplan theory. There are 2 different ways that counterplans are theoretically challenged. That is either their status or their type. In part 1, we discussed what each of these are, but let's do a little review here. The status of the counterplan refers to when a negative team is allowed to kick the counterplan in a debate. There are 3 statuses: conditional, unconditional, and dispositional. Remember, in part 1, we went through each of these, but let's talk about them right now. Conditional counterplans can be kicked by the negative whenever they would like to, regardless of what arguments the affirmative has made against the counterplan. Anytime, anywhere, they can kick the counterplan, no penalty, no restrictions. Unconditional counterplans, on the other hand, can never be kicked. Once they're introduced in the 1 and C, the negative team must extend them through the end of the debate. Dispositional counterplans are the 3rd type and are admittedly a bit confusing as to what this type actually is. Dispositional counterplans are counterplans that cannot be kicked if the affirmative team straight turns a counterplan. Straight turning the counterplan means they only read offense against it. In part 2 of this lecture series, we talked about which affirmative arguments were offense against the counterplan. If the affirmative team only makes those arguments, the counterplan is straight turned and the negative cannot kick it. Typically, negative teams choose to read their counterplan conditionally, giving them flexibility to kick it whenever they would like. Very few teams read their counterplan unconditionally because it takes away that flexibility in deciding what to go for in your final speech. Very few teams also read their counterplan dispositionally because it's confusing or hard to determine if the counterplan has been straight turned or not. My recommendation is that the negative team reads their counterplan conditionally. There's really no scenario in my mind under which you would want to read it under any other conditions. Affirmative teams can challenge the status of the counterplan, arguing that the status chosen is illegitimate. Here's an example of what a challenge from the affirmative might look like. You can see on your screen in front of you scenario 1. The negative team read a conditional counterplan. The affirmative responded by arguing that conditionality is bad. They first started with an interpretation for how the affirmative thinks the counterplan should be run. Then they made arguments for why the status the negative chose was bad. On the left side, you're going to see what the affirmative said. The affirmative said conditionality is bad. Their interpretation is that the negative only gets to read their counterplan unconditionally. Their interpretation for the debate was instead of getting to read your counterplan conditionally, you get to read your counterplan unconditionally. The affirmative team thinks this is best for debate because conditionality destroys AF strategy, causes argument irresponsibility. They invested time to answer it, and the negative just gets to kick it without a penalty. It creates bad debates where the negative can just go for the argument that was answered the least in the debate. On the negative response side, the negative team's response uh, in the block is to respond to theory by deploying the same strategy the affirmative used. First, they give their own interpretation. Second, they answer the affirmative's offense. And third, they present offense of their own. In the first scenario, the negative team made sure that their interpretation matched what they actually did, and they provided offense for why conditionality was good. And also they answered the affirmative's offense. So the negative's response is conditionality is good. Our interpretation is that we get one conditional counterplan. They also went on to say prefer our interpretation that conditionality is good because it's critical to negative flexibility. We shouldn't be forced to defend arguments that aren't going to win the round. Let's just say are instead of are. And it's also key to critical thinking. Forcing the affirmative to pick only their best arguments and think ahead is vital to cost benefit analysis. Argument irresponsibility is non-unique because we could also introduce a bunch of DAs or T arguments that we could pick. The negative's response is really good because not only did they provide their own offense, which was negative flexibility and critical thinking, but they sort of internally answered some of the arguments the affirmative made. Critical thinking was used to answer affirmative strategy. Argument irresponsibility is non unique, is used to answer argument irresponsibility. So they sort of kind of combined some of these parts in order to have a more clear and concise way of answering this theory attack. Let's look at another scenario. Scenario two is a bit more advanced. In this scenario, the negative team read two conditional counterplans in their debate. Instead of arguing that conditionality is bad in its entirety, this affirmative team instead decided to argue that the negative team shouldn't get two conditional advocacies, but instead just one. Instead of saying all conditionality is bad, the affirmative said multiple conditional advocacies are bad. This is tricky because it forces the negative team to defend exactly what they did and not conditionality as a whole. If the negative responds that conditionality is good, the affirmative team can be like, yeah, we agree with that. But the negative has no reason why multiple conditional counterplans are good. For practice, see if you can fill out what the negative would respond to on the blank screen on your right. I've given you a place to do this in your notes document. Shifting gears here a bit, I'd like to focus on theory arguments now that deal with the type of counterplan being read. The easiest way to identify what type of counterplan is being read is based on how the counterplan is different from the plan. Here's a list of types of counterplans that you might encounter this year. Agent counterplans. An agent counterplan changes the agent that the plan uses to something different. For example, counterplans that use the executive branch instead of the Supreme Court are agent counterplans. PICs or plan inclusive counterplans is a type of counterplan where the negative does all of the plan except for one small portion. The negative team would argue that that portion of the plan is bad, so the counterplan does not do that. Essentially, they pick or pull out a portion of the plan text and say that that portion is bad. The next type of counterplan is called multi-actor counterplans. These counterplans use multiple different actors instead of just the one actor of the plan. There are also process counterplans that change the process by which the plan is implemented. These counterplans would employ a process for doing the plan that is different than the one the affirmative team uses. Process counterplans are definitely going to be a big part of this topic, and one has been produced by the SDI that we will be looking at shortly. The next type of counterplans are 50 state counterplans. You may have encountered these in the past couple of years. These are counterplans that use the state government in some capacity instead of using the federal government. Finally, there are international actor counterplans. These counterplans use an international actor, like a different country or organization, instead of using the United States federal government. This list is not exhaustive of all the types of counterplans there are out there, and sometimes counterplans fall into one or more of these categories. Affirmative teams can argue that each of these types are bad for debate and shouldn't be allowed in debate. And typically, these debates are a little bit more simple than status debates. Because the affirmative team is arguing that the type of counterplan is bad, the negative is arguing that the type is good. There really isn't any wiggle room for specific interpretations like we see with status debates. I want to look more specifically at international counterplans, as this will be important to this year's topic. His resolution calls for affirmative teams to increase the USFG's security cooperation with NATO. Counterplans could have other countries increase its security cooperation with NATO instead. Because there are 195 countries, 30 of which are in NATO, there are a lot of different international counterplans possible. If the negative team does choose to introduce an international counterplan, the counterplan would mandate a country that is not the US to take the action that the plan takes. This requires what is called international fiat. Remember, fiat that expands beyond the traditional scope of having the United States federal government do something is what the affirmative is criticizing. Typically, fiat is kind of waving your magic wand and saying that the federal government is going to do the plan and we're going to debate the effects or the outcomes of that. Affirmative teams say, extending that ability to fiat to international organizations or other countries is a bridge too far. It is an abusive use of the negative's ability to fiat. What you see on the screen in front of you is kind of a setup where The affirmative international actor Fiat bad arguments are on your left, and the negatives responses are on the right. Let's look at some of the affirmative arguments first. The first argument affirmative teams will probably make against international fiat is that there are way too many countries to predict and prepare for. There are a total of 195 countries, most of which are in the United Nations, two of which are observers. There is some question about country status for places like Taiwan and Palestine and the Holy See. And so there's a lot, right, that you would have to prepare for as the affirmative for a counterplan block to each one of these 195 different countries. So it's just a huge research burden on the affirmative that makes it really hard to be affirmative on that type of topic. The second kind of goes along with the first, but there isn't a solvency advocate that would compare US action to another country's action in terms of a place like NATO security cooperation, which means the affirmative can't even really read specific solvency arguments against the counterplan. The argument here is that even if the affirmative were able to prepare for all of the different countries, there aren't any authors or there isn't any literature out there that compares US and another country's action, so we wouldn't be able to find materials that would actually be good for the debate. The third reason why international fiat might be bad is that there's no opportunity cost. Remember from earlier parts of this lecture series, opportunity costs are reasons why we should do one action over another. For this component, the affirmative team is basically arguing that the counterplan doesn't test if the AF is a good idea or a bad idea. Just that other countries doing the AF could be good. It's just not a reason why the plan is bad. So it doesn't really test whether the affirmative is a good idea or a bad idea. In the same vein, it also might be that it destroys topic education. The focus of the resolution this year says the United States federal government should increase its security cooperation with NATO. And when we introduce another country into the mix, then it's shifting us away from the central focus, which is US NATO cooperation, into another country. This destroys topic education and kind of takes the focus away from what we actually should be learning about. The next reason why international fiat might be a bad idea is that it's not considered real world, that policymakers in the United States would never have to pick between the US doing an action or another country doing the action. They don't kind of sit around and be like, okay, should we do it or should we like throw it off to Canada? And so because it's not real world, it's not something that we should be practicing in debate. The final argument the affirmative team could potentially make is that the negative doesn't need to read an international fiat counterplan. They should instead just read country disadvantages. The negative team should get to read these disads as a way to get, education about other countries or to kind of challenge the affirmative use of the United States federal government, but they shouldn't get the ability to read it as a counterplan. Disads allow the affirmative to straight turn it. There are only a certain amount of disads that, can be around or be read in the debate. And they're just easier for the affirmative team to outweigh or to argue against. So that kind of last argument is just that you shouldn't get to do a counter plan. You should do a disad instead. Now, note, the affirmative could also make what is called an object fiat bad argument. If the negative chooses to read a NATO counterplan, since NATO is the object of the resolution and the counterplan would have NATO take an action, they remove USFG security cooperation altogether. This would fiat, like I said, the object of the resolution. Affirmative teams could argue that object fiat is bad because, again, it shifts focus from US NATO cooperation to individual NATO action, which kills topic education, amongst a number of other arguments that you could make for object fiat. Now, on the other side of the debate, the negative is obviously going to respond. They can do so in a way that sort of eliminates or neutralizes a big portion of the affirmative's offense. These arguments include, first, an interpretation. Negative team could say that negative teams only get international counterplans that have a solvency advocate associated with them. So instead of getting to read 195 countries, they say we only get to read international counterplans that have a solvency advocate for that counterplan, which narrows it down quite a bit. This interpretation helps neutralize a bunch of the affirmative offense because it removes no solvency advocates, it limits down the 195 countries, and it really kind of draws the debate in to make it a lot less large. The negative can also and should also introduce a bunch of defensive arguments to answer the affirmative's offense. They could say literature limits the prep. There's only so much literature written about countries increasing their security cooperation with NATO. So if they can only read counterpoints from those countries, have an advocate, it limits what the affirmative has to prep. And it also means it's predictable. The negative team can also say that US key warrants means the AF will always have offense. This is basically just saying that the negative wants the affirmative to have a reason that the US is key, and they want to have disadvantages to US action or prove that there's a cost to the AF and a benefit to the counterplan. Finally, to answer real world, they want to argue that debate isn't real world. We're not USFG policymakers. We are allowed to evaluate different policies, even if typically we would be outside the purview of Congress. And the president could suggest another country do something instead. Or offensive arguments the negative can make, like this type of counterplan is key to test USFG in the resolution. The resolution says the United States federal government should increase security cooperation. And so eliminating the ability for the negative to test the United States federal government robs the negative of a whole portion of negative ground on the topic. The negative can also read offense that's based on flexibility. International topics already limit what kind of counterplans the negative can read, so the negative needs to have access to international counterplans on international topics. And finally, the negative could argue that it's key to education. NATO has 30 members. Learning about each member's interaction with the security organization and with the United States is vital education, and eliminating international counterplan robs the negative of that education. Remember, this is not an exhaustive list of all the theory or even all the arguments that can be made against international fiat, but these are kind of a good set to kind of get you thinking about what you could say against this type of counterplan. Thank you so much for watching part 4 of this lecture series. In part 5, we're going to discuss specific counterplans on this year's topic. Remember, you can always go back and rewatch parts of this lecture that you found confusing or didn't understand, and you can always email me with questions if you have them.